Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rupal Ramesh Shah, and I'm the Executive Director of Konbit Sante. Thank you for being here to help kick off our first panel in a series of discussions in which we celebrate Konbit Sante's 20th anniversary. For 20 years, our organization has worked hard to support the development of a sustainable healthcare system that meets the needs of the people of Cap-Haitian Haiti. Konbit Sante's success over the years is due to the unwavering support of those who believe in us. Before we get started today, I'd like to acknowledge and thank all our committed donors, volunteers, supporters, and staff, those that work with our organization today and those who have contributed over the years. I most especially would like to thank the key participants of today's panel who are here to share Konbit Sante's story from the beginning. At this time, I'm also delighted to introduce an incredible moderator for today's session, my colleague, Rod Harmon. Rod has worked tirelessly to organize these panels and the series of experts to best showcase the last 20 years of Konbit Sante. Thank you, Rod, and I invite you to take it away for us.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Looking Back, Konbit Sante's early years, the first in a series of webinars celebrating the 20th anniversary of Konbit Sante Cap-Haitian Health Partnership. Since 2001, Konbit Sante has supported the development of a sustainable health system in Cap-Haitian, the largest city in northern Haiti and the second largest city in the country. Rather than create a parallel healthcare system governed from afar, Konbit Sante partners with the Haiti Ministry of Health and with 2 public hospitals and 2 private healthcare facilities in Cap-Haitian. It has 2 permanent offices, a US-based office located in Falmouth, Maine, and a Haiti-based office in Cap-Haitian that is staffed primarily by Haitians. Throughout this webinar, members of the audience may post questions to the panelists in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will review and ask questions posed in the Q&A section at the end of this webinar. Please note that questions will only be considered if they are entered into the Q&A section. Questions entered in the chat section will not be considered. This webinar will be recorded and posted online at a later date. I would also like to remind our viewers that they can donate online at any time at konbitsante.org/donate. And you can find more information on our website, konbitsante.org. That's KONBITSANTE.org. I will now introduce our panelists for tonight's webinar. Dr. Michael Taylor, MD, is co-founder of Konbit Sante. Michael is a retired dermatologist in Portland with a career-long interest in international and community medicine. He is a graduate of Amherst College, the University of Buffalo Medical School, and Harvard School of Public Health. In addition to his medical degree, he holds a master's degree in public health. Dr. Taylor continues to serve Konbit Sante as an honorary advisor. Welcome, Michael. With him is Wendy Taylor, Dr. Taylor's wife and co-founder of Konbit Sante. A graduate of DePaul University, Wendy worked in market research and planning for large financial institutions in Chicago and Colorado, and owned a national market research business. She currently serves Konbit Sante as an honorary advisor, as a member of our communications and fundraising committee. Dr. Nathan Nickerson is one of Konbit Sante's earliest members and his first executive director. Nate has a Bachelor of Science degree from Tufts University and from the University of Southern Maine, a master's degree in nursing from Simmons College, and a PhD in international public health from Boston University. He served as executive director for Konbit Sante for 15 years before retiring in 2020, and currently serves as an honorary advisor. Dr. Aoife Lathrop, MD, is an OB/GYN physician and the Global Medical Director for Population Services International, where she oversees a service delivery portfolio that spans over 30 countries. Eva was one of Konbit Sante's founding board members and continues to work with Konbit Sante as a volunteer to advance initiatives to improve maternal health outcomes. Dr. Henry Perry, MD, is an honorary advisor to Konbit Sante since its founding. Dr. Perry has spent his career working in global health. He has lived in Haiti and has worked in countries throughout the world. He is a senior scientist in the Health Systems Program of the Department of International Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and is the author of more than 200 publications related to global health. And Dina Libner, Chief of Staff for the City Manager in Portland, Maine. The city has been a supporter of Konbit Sante since its early days. It has had a sister city relationship with CAP patients since 2003. Prior to working for Portland, Dina worked for the New York City Council and with various nonprofit organizations in New York City, including the Central Park Conservancy, an NYC and Company, the Official Destination Marketing Organization of the City of New York. And you have met our current Executive Director, Rupal Ramesh Shah. Thank you, everyone. Okay, Michael, I'd like to start this off with you. Please take us back to a few years before the founding of Konbit Sante. At the time, you were a practicing dermatologist who participated in medical trips to developing countries. How did that experience form the germ of what would become Konbit Sante?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to have been invited back. I've been away from Konbit Sante as an active member for more than a decade, although I have been involved in various activities and I'm kept up to date by Wendy. Wendy and I took a medical mission to the Dominican Republic in 1998. And from that experience, Konbit Sante evolved. The experience itself was rather typical of a group of healthcare providers and other volunteers choosing someplace on the global map to drop in for a week and provide whatever medical services they were capable of, and then leave. I called it a type of medical tourism. We did participate before we understood the full implications of what we were doing. As an example, our group went to different clinical sites every day for 5 days. One of the sites was taking place in a elementary school. And in the tropics, the schools often have a U-shaped architecture with grounds in the middle for playgrounds, for eating, for celebrations, and so forth. When we arrived, we were given bare space, and we had pharmaceutical supplies that had been donated and gathered through volunteer efforts and local physicians. Many of them were out of date, which was not a problem for the Dominican Republic and did not seem to be a problem for the leaders of our program. Just as an aside, Konbit Sante has never done that. We haven't taken cast-off medications. But there was no one who could, in the group, who could serve as the pharmacist. So Wendy volunteered to be the pharmacist because jokingly, she said, well, I can read the names of the medicines. She organized things and it functioned fairly well until the dentist, who was out in the schoolyard under a little canopy tent, primarily pulling teeth. There was no dental care. The volunteer who had agreed to help him couldn't do it physically and emotionally. She just was unable to see all of the blood and to participate in yanking of teeth. So the call went out to have someone else replace her. That volunteer was Wendy, and Wendy became the tooth thrower. Excuse me.
Sorry.
She became the tooth thrower. The dentist would yank the tooth, hand it in forceps to Wendy, and she would cast it out into the grounds, and the chickens would come along and bite any piece of tissue that they could off the teeth.
Dr. Taylor, you mentioned in earlier conversations I've had with you that there was a moment when you and Wendy were both in the Dominican Republic, and you had a nurse come up because she had identified diabetes in a patient.
Correct.
You talk a little bit about that, because that spawned a discussion between you and Wendy on how to do things differently, correct?
You're right. I have a tendency to be long-winded, so I'll just get to that point. The nurse had brought a handheld glucose meter, and she came rushing over to Wendy and me and said, "I just diagnosed a patient with diabetes. Her blood sugar level is over 400. And Wendy and I looked at one another incredulous because there was no insulin, no refrigeration, no way in which this woman's diet could change, no public health nursing to help with the injection. And it came to our conclusion that we were not doing any service. In fact, we were probably contributing to grief. So at any rate, on the way home, we said, well, there certainly is a need, and we can put together a program that meets that need without being casual about it. So we decided to put together a program using the resources that were available in Portland, Maine, and finding a spot where the need would match our resources. I'll stop there, although I could go on and on.
Well, Wendy, I'm interested in when Michael floated this, was it during that plane ride home, or was it later in discussion where Michael floated the idea of starting a nonprofit organization dedicated to a developing country? You didn't know whether to be Haiti at that time, correct? But what was your reaction to that?
Well, I wasn't surprised. This is very Michael whole process. I mean, remember, he was a Peace Corps physician and also did a lot of outreach work in community medicine in Maine before becoming a dermatologist. But I came across some notes that we had written before the first group of people to discuss it got together. And what Michael was proposing was having an ongoing supportive relationship in one under-resourced location. And because we wouldn't have the resources, we didn't feel in Portland, the greater Portland area at least, to build something and maintain it and be there ourselves all the time, that we would look for a site probably where there was already some infrastructure and where the important part was medical care would be available even when people from the US were not there, needed some ongoing support. I thought it was a great idea. And of course, Michael knew a lot of people in Portland, and I think that made a big difference.
So how did you form the founding group? Was it mostly your colleagues in Portland through your medical connections?
Well, it was colleagues and other community members. We had, for example, Don Nickel, who had been Ed Muskie's chief of staff, to help us do planning. Don McDowell was president of Maine Medical Center at that time. Jim Moody was a businessman who was president of Hannaford. So we had community members as well as professional healthcare folks. Part of it came through my prior experience working at Maine Medical Center, but a lot of it came from my medical practice in dermatology. I was able to meet and become friendly with a lot of people in the community. So I did have connections with a variety of folks outside of medicine.
Right, Nate, Eva, and Henry, this question is for the three of you. What drew you to Konbit Sante? Why did you decide to join the organization? Furthermore, why have you all stayed with the organization in some capacity for 20 years? Nate, you can go first.
Yeah,
Sure.
Nate should go first.
All right, sure. Well, my first exposure was Michael calling me and telling me about his some of these thoughts. I think the thing that I found compelling about what he said that he was, this is my recollection, Michael, is that you had gathered a number of people, many of them who had some experience with international health, kind of, it sounded like mission trip kind of models that people found satisfying in the short term in terms of serving a lot of people on the ground, but dissatisfying in a longer term, and that this feeling, as you described, that nothing much was left behind, that it wasn't clear in terms of the longer term benefit for people. That really interested me to think about what's a different way to do it than the dominant narrative, the dominant paradigm in terms of how that was done. I think most of us, when we think about global health, think about mission trips going down and sort of providing for. And I think to me that was, it was the first step in a whole journey, as I like to say, in terms of trying to figure out what that other path might be, because there weren't a lot of signposts, there weren't a lot of guideposts, there wasn't a map in terms of where you go with this. So in terms of your second question, Rod, why stay with it this long? Because it's a long road to go from point A to point B here in terms of looking at a different model. And as long as it was continued to be out there in front of us, it seemed really worthwhile to work on it.
Eva, can you go next?
Hi, everybody. Rod, thanks for the question. Before I answer it, I just want to say it is so much fun to look through the participants. I just peeked at the list of people, and it is just a thrill to think about so many of you and having met you so long ago and done great work with you, good friends, family. And it's such a, it almost answers the second part of your question. It's really fun to be doing this with everybody tonight. We've spent seven of us have spent a lot of time on Zoom together lately. And this is great to think about how we started to come together. And I'll frame this by saying that when Michael and Wendy and the rest of the founding crew were having these initial discussions about forming what became Konbit Sante, I was an intern at Maine Med in the OBGYN department. And I think I was invited out of being in the right place at the right time. And when I first met Michael and Wendy, I think, Michael, you can refute this if it isn't true, but I think that the fact that I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer was totally appealing to Michael. I think the assumption was that, I must immediately get the framing that he was articulating about how to build a long-term relationship and embed with a community and do work that's really led by locally identified priorities. And so I think that despite my youth and early career, I think there was still an appeal, maybe for those reasons, actually. And a lot of the lessons that I learned in Peace Corps are those early lessons that framed my own global health career, having bilateral learnings as a focus, ensuring that the scope of work is really dictated by what your local counterparts and leaders have identified, and sticking with it for the long term. And I think that we've stayed true to some of those early lessons. And I was an intern. I was game to support this work. Believe me, I recognized quickly an opportunity to spend time with this much more senior group of experts, get me out of the hospital. I remember thinking I just spent the evening sitting around a table learning from people who I immediately admired and thought, we're going to have a long-term relationship together, and being thrilled by that. So those were my very, very earliest days. And again, this was before this was Konbit Sante. And why stay? I mean, I have a really, really long list, which I won't give you necessarily now, but I think if I had to say two things, it is the commitment to taking the long view. And that has always been a shared commitment by everybody on this call and people who've stuck with the work. And then the second is the people. This is a Konbit, and I would say that some of my very best personal and professional experiences have been with this Konbit family. And I don't think a lot of people get to say that about their work and their volunteer work and their board commitment. So I'll stop there, but there's much more if you have any further questions, or if anybody wants to put anything in the chat. And I have some good stories.
Yes, thank you, Eva. And as Eva mentioned, if you have a question for any of the panelists, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We will, as time allows, address those questions at the end of the webinar. Henry, same question to you. Why did you join Konbit Sante, and why have you stuck with us for all these years?
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Rod. My roots to this go way, way back. I came to Portland, Maine in 1976 to begin a residency in general surgery, planning to spend my life working in global health. And I was drawn to the Maine Medical Center because of the breadth of training that I'd be able to get in general surgery. And I had such a wonderful experience during those 5 years and got to know so many people. And one of them was Mike Taylor. He was the director of community medicine at the Maine Medical Center and had an interest in global health at that time. And there weren't really very many people at the time who had that broader perspective. And so it's interesting how much things have changed over my lifetime in terms of awareness about global health issues and experiences. But I finished my training in 1981, and then 20 years later, I happened to be the director of the Hospital Albert Schweitzer in Haiti. And I kept up with many of my dear Portland friends, and Mike and Wendy knew that I was down there, and I started getting emails from Mike. And I learned that they were looking for a place to develop a relationship, as has been described here already. And I was very impressed with that. I knew there were a lot of good people, good-hearted people in Portland. I myself had spent quite a few years starting a similar NGO through my work in Bolivia back in 1981, and I was enthusiastic about what a small NGO could do. And I was impressed with the seriousness of the interest in the long-term commitment that was being envisioned. And I was also impressed by how much Mike and others had looked around for potential sites where they might work. And I could, of course, give them an insider's perspective about Haiti since I was living there. And so it was a great way for me to reconnect. And then as the years went by, in 2006, I had a chance to serve on an evaluation of what had developed up till that time. And then Nate had come along by then, and he had been a nurse at the Maine Medical Center, and we shared similar backgrounds in a lot of different ways. And I was, of course, very impressed with Nate. I ended up being on Nate's doctoral thesis committee at Boston University back about that time in 2007, and got to know Nate even better. And then a few years later, I found myself teaching at Johns Hopkins, and I was teaching a course called Management of NGOs in the Health Sector. And for 4 or 5 years, I invited Nate to come down and speak with our students about his experience running Konbit Sante, and it enabled Nate and me to stay in touch and hear what was going on. And so it's been a great thrill. The NGO that I started, which is now called Cure Americas Global, it was originally called A&D in Rural Healthcare, has also served as somewhat of a mentor over the years in various ways to the organization, and not just me, but other people working with us. So we've felt a little bit like we had a sister partnership in certain ways, which has been nice as well. So it's a real thrill for me to be here tonight to reflect on these early years.
Great, thank you, Dr. Perry. All right, let's get to the why. One question that was posed in the chat is why Haiti, first of all. Secondly, and more specifically, why Cap-Haitian Haiti? So I'd like to pose that question to the group. And as a follow-up question, how did you come up with the name Konbit Sante? And why did you choose that as a name of the organization? Dr. Taylor, can you start?
Yeah, I'll start, and others join, please. When we formed the organization, we did not have a specific destination. We wanted to find a place that would match our resources with the needs of the site. And we looked at several places. We took a trip to Guatemala and looked at sites there. We had been to Panama. And through connections with the University of Miami, Art Fournier, who is head of family medicine and global health at the University of Miami, came up to Portland and talked with our board members and volunteers and suggested that we take a trip and look at various sites in Haiti, which we did. And we saw 3 sites that were not quite matching, and then arrived in Cap-Haitian that had a hospital with a radiology unit that had not been functional for 3 or 4 years. Imagine a hospital of 150 beds without an X-ray unit. Tuberculosis being a prominent problem, as well as trauma. And the staff there seemed welcoming. It was accessible to us. And when I went back to Portland, I put together a prenuptial group. There were 13 of us, volunteers, who went down to survey the place to make sure that there was a consensus that we could do it and would want to do it.
Great. And Nate, can you talk about the Konbit Sante name? The original name, incidentally, for the group was the Greater Portland International Health Initiative. But within a year, the name was changed to Konbit Sante. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, that first name doesn't really roll off your tongue very well, and nor does it really describe a philosophy or a model. It was actually, when we were searching for a name, it was a Peace Corps volunteer in Haiti named Brian Schaff, who is Schleff, right?
Schaff.
Schaff, I'm sorry, who I think is still very invested in advocating for Haiti all these years later, who had been there, I think, a couple of years and described what a Konbit meant. And I think everybody who's familiar with Konbit Sante knows that story about what a Konbit means, but it's really a Haitian construct or an idea. A Konbit is really a work collaborative of people working shoulder to shoulder towards a common cause. It was often used in the context of an agricultural field, but it also applies to almost any common cause. And I think it felt so aligned with what was developing as how we wanted to work, which was not coming in and imposing a lot of things, but really sitting together and figuring some things out. It really, to me, the analogous thing in our part of the country is a barn raising, where the community gets together and helps a farmer raise a barn. But the barn is raised to the specifications and needs of the farmer, not to the people coming to help raise the barn. So it fit. And I would just say one other thing is we had a lot of conversation at the time whether we should have a Creole name or not, because how many Americans would understand what Konbit Sante would mean? And I think we came down on the side of saying, well, they'll learn what it means, and then it will come to mean what it means. It will come to mean, it gives us an opportunity to explain every time someone asks. So,
thank you. In 2002, Konbit Sante made its first fact-finding trip to Cap Haitian. And I'm going to share my screen briefly so you can see a photo from that first trip. Can everybody see that on their screen?
Yes.
Yes, and see there's Dr. Taylor and there's Eva back here and other members of the team that was on the initial group with Cap Haitian. So for those of you who are on that trip, and Nate and Wendy, I know you're on that trip too, even though you're not in the photo. What kind of memories does this photo bring up? What memories from that first trip come to mind?
Rod, that was actually in 2001, just that when we were talking about the 20th anniversary, it's the anniversary of that trip, I think. So.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, what comes to mind from the first trip to Cap Haitian, that first fact-finding trip? What were your initial thoughts from what you saw on the ground, from what you encountered in the healthcare system, in the facilities themselves? Did you think this is going to take an awful lot of work? Oh my God, this is insurmountable. What were your feelings? And Mike, we'll start with you.
Oh, mine. Well, I had already been down on a prior occasion, so I was familiar with the setting and felt comfortable. It was frankly much more poverty-stricken than Nigeria was in the 1960s when I was in the Peace Corps there. Haiti was much worse and confusing. It wasn't organized the way most countries are. But the staff were highly educated, doing yeoman's work under very miserable circumstances, and could really benefit from our boost. So I was quite pleased with making that choice.
And Wendy, what were your first thoughts?
Well, I think the discussion about the healthcare system's best left to Eva and Nate and
Okay.
Henry probably too.
Okay. All right, Eva?
Yeah, I can jump in, Rod. I think, again, I was halfway through my residency and I had, the resident's perspective, which turned out to be important in that I spent most of that trip with OBGYN residents at the Justinian Hospital. I met people who became lifelong friends. I also saw immediately the tremendous knowledge and capacity among these residents and their faculty members, but the incredible system challenges and logistics challenges that were there. So it was immediately obvious to me that my role, if I could continue to have one, was going to be a supportive role, number one, and number two, that it would have to be a long-term role and a long-term commitment, that these weren't things that were going to be solved fast. This wasn't, the issue was not, if I just can help you understand how to manage postpartum hemorrhage, things will be better. No, certainly my resident colleagues at the Justinian could manage postpartum hemorrhage much better than I could at that point in my career, mostly because they saw it all the time. And so that it was clear right away that supporting and following local leadership and identification of priorities was going to be the job, that it was going to take a long time, and that I better learn Creole, which I did do.
All right, Nate?
Yeah, I guess I have to say that I was a bit overwhelmed. I thought one of my favorite sayings is that for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's wrong. And I think that this applied here. There was no silver bullet, and it became really clear to me that if we were going to make any real difference, which was what it was about, the first thing I needed to do was put in the due diligence to try to understand what was going on, that we didn't have all the answers, and that this, if we were going to make a difference, this was going to be a long-term investment in understanding and beginning piece by piece to have relationships, contribute what we can. But it was going to be a while before we can even understand what was going on. It was kind of overwhelming to me in terms of what was there and what wasn't there. Having said that, I agree that the people that we met just saw so much potential. The systems that we saw, not so much. So that was really challenging.
Now let's dovetail that into a question about how the mission statement and the mission of Konbit Sante was formed, because it took several months to actually come up with a mission statement that you were comfortable with of the scope of the work that you were planning on doing in Haiti. Is that correct?
Correct.
And why did it take that long? What was the process involved?
Because the existing model of flying in, doing something in a schoolyard for a week and leaving without any health opportunities for maintaining the blood pressure, the blood sugar, you name it. That was the model. And as we came to learn after we made our mission statement, which took about 7 months, and it was 7 months well spent. People sometimes think that mission statements and planning are a waste of time. This particular mission statement has lasted for 20 years, and it has been a guidepost when we've had questions about choices that we were making. So we had to make up something that, at least to that point, had not been a model for healthcare in foreign countries.
And what was the reaction of the Haitians themselves and the Ministry of Health? Because they weren't used to this model, right?
They were confused, and as Nate and Eva and now Rupal know very well, when American healthcare workers arrived in Haiti, they were bringing with them money to build structures and to disperse however the leaders in the community wanted. We were not bringing money. We were bringing a partnership. And although that made intellectual sense to us, it was very confusing to the Haitians. They were suspicious of us for the first couple of years. I mean, one of our first tasks was to woo them, to gain their trust. When we went down, the first thing we did was meet with the leadership and tell them we're here. This is what we plan to do. And as we were leaving, we always had a party at Laurent Christophe hotel that included that leadership with their wives dressed in their finery, talking about what we had done and what we intended to do. So we had social bonding as well as medical bonding, but it took a while for us to gain that trust, which Nate and Eva and others have won in spades. They've done it.
I'd like to remind our viewers that if you have a question for our panelists, please log in into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will answer those as time allows at the end of the session. And I would also like to remind our viewers that you can learn more about Konbit Sante at our website, www.konbitsante.org, and you can donate at konbitsante.org/donate, which you can see on your screen now.
What about sister cities?
Yes. Michael, you were instrumental in approaching the city of Portland to propose to establish a sister city relationship with the CAP patient. Can you describe talk a little bit about that and how you started?
I'll briefly talk about it, but Dina is really here to bring us up to date.
Yes.
As a community medicine type of physician, I've always felt that it was important, critical, to bring in the non-health community and to really make links in several different ways, business, churches, and so forth. We had an opportunity to join sister cities with the city of Portland, their counselors and the city manager agreeing, and we've had that link now for 18 years or so. Jill Dustin, Peter O'Donnell, Cheryl Lehman, and other city councilors really advocated and approved it. But now let me turn it over to Dina, and she can bring us up to date on the relationship.
Yes, Dina. First of all, can you describe for people who are not familiar with a sister city relationship, particularly as it pertains to the city of Portland, what that entails? And secondly, why did Portland decide to develop a sister city relationship with CAP patient Haiti?
Sure. A sister city relationship is defined primarily by a cultural exchange between two cities who are interested in learning and growing from one another. The relationship with CAP patient is very, very unique. It's the newest by about 20 years that Portland has. It only has 3 sister city relationships, and it's the only one that was initiated by a third party, by a nonprofit organization. And someone was speaking earlier about that social bonding that was necessary in Haiti. I think that you did the exact same thing in Portland. You established relationships and built that relationship between the two cities. And I think without that social bonding and bridge building, that sister city relationship wouldn't be here today. You won the support, I know, of the city council and mayor at the time, voted unanimously in support of that new relationship, although they hadn't taken that initiative in 2 or so decades. It's funny, I pulled up the resolution that formalized that relationship, and it talks about how the city council and the mayor were so inspired by the work of Konbit Sante prior to the sister city relationship, and that 20 medical professionals, 20 plus medical professionals had gone over, and how the city was inspired to be a more active part of different cities' lives and well-being, and to learn from one another. And I think you really woke something up in the city of Portland that had not been really formally recognized in many, many years. And again, this relationship is very unique in that it's the only one that was established by a third party. So I thought that was very, very special. And so ever since then, I know that it's funny, the city council and the mayor and the city manager have turned over many, many times. And an enduring part of the government is, among a few other things, those sister city relationships. So I know, I believe even our most recent mayor has participated in some fundraising events with Konbit Sante. She's only been in the position for, I think, 2 years, and already she's gotten her feet wet, recognizing what an important relationship that one is. And I know that Jill Duson, who you mentioned, who only very recently retired, was active up until the very end of her tenure as a counselor. And that this relationship was so important to her. And I think 20 years, she was active in city government for 20 years. Konbit Sante was an enduring priority for her for those 2 decades as well. We're very grateful for the organization, inspiring the city with your passion and your commitment. And again, you talk a lot about having the long view. And I think that's something probably that we in government appreciate and can be inspired by your commitment.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina. And Konbit Sante is very thankful for the city of Portland for its years of support and everything that you have done for our organization. Thank you very much for that.
And
Yes, Dr. Taylor.
may I just add a couple of things. Jill Duson went down with us to help unload a container of medical supplies, met with the mayor and exchanged a citation between the cities. She was politically astute enough not to tell the mayor that the flag of Haiti was mounted upside down on his desk. And we exchanged, we didn't, but we instigated the exchange of priests from Portland and Cap Haitian. Father Jim Nadeau went down with us on one occasion and brought up Dr. Zephyr, who is a priest in Cap Haitian, to Portland. So it really has been a community-wide effort.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Nate, I'd like to touch a little bit about your tenure. There's not enough time on this webinar, probably for a 24-hour webinar, to talk about all your work you've done during your 15 years with Konbit Sante. But my question to you is, when Michael approached you about becoming executive director, what were your thoughts about accepting that role? And over the years, what would you say are the things that, what are your big takeaways from your time as ED with Konbit Sante?
Yeah, those are big questions. I don't know if Michael approached me about being executive director as much as I approached him about it, but we had actually at the time, I think that one of the big changes was that Konbit Sante had been a completely volunteer organization. And somewhat through Michael's tenacity, which I learned something about, we snagged a USAID grant. But it became really clear to get a US government grant is not something that can be managed necessarily by a volunteer organization. It requires a professional level kind of management. And if Konbit Sante wanted to make the decision to go that direction, to seek other resources and expand its impact through seeking funding and supporting programs that way, we need a professional staff to do that. And so that became a board discussion at that point, and I was interested in a change at that point. You know, I used to be, I had a corner office at City Hall at that point. I used to be the director of public health and left then to do this. And so that's the first part. I think the board had to come up with a decision about whether it wanted to move in that direction or not. And it did. And that, you know, that was a fork in the road, and that's where we've pursued it in the 15 years after that. So your other question was?
Yeah, what were the big takeaways during your tenure? What has your mindset towards Haiti changed during that time? And so,
yeah, I mean, Haiti's been a great teacher about all kinds of things. I think that every time I think I understand something, it gets deconstructed, dismantled, and I have to have a new understanding. But that's been good, and I hope it's been a mutual learning experience for all my friends in Haiti. I think, again, what I've learned is things are quite complicated. I'll tell you, when we first went to Haiti, we'd have these meetings and discussions and come up with different ideas, and everyone in the room would shake their heads and say, "Oh no, it's more complicated. It's complicated. You don't understand. It's complicated." And I remember saying to a friend, "I think you're just saying it's complicated whenever you don't want to do something." And as the years passed, I found that I was the person in the room saying, "No, it's more complicated than that. It's not so simple. There's not a simple silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. It's really a much more complex thing that we need to work on." And so I think it's framed a lot of my understanding of the world and how the world works, and also what the possibilities are when we work together. I know it takes two things for things to work really well. It takes a strong organization and really good people. But if you're going to have one or the other, if you have a strong organization and you don't have really good people, it's not going to work. If you have really good people and the organization's not strong, things can still happen. And I think that's what happens in Haiti. Even though sometimes the systems are weak, there are people that I admire a lot who step up and really make a difference. And I've learned a lot from them.
Great. Over the years, we've received some comments from people in the States, and this is typical of any nonprofit organization who works overseas. Why are you spending all this time, money, and resources working in other countries? Why don't you do more good in your own backyard? And secondly, people have been pouring money into Haiti and giving aid to Haiti for years. So at what point does it stop? Are you throwing money into a bottomless pit? Dr. Taylor, would you like to address that?
Well, I have been asked that question by friends who actually refused to donate to Konbit Sante, saying there's such a need at home. Why are you and the volunteers going down to Haiti? And my response has been, and it's valid, that if you look closely, it's the same people who take themselves down to Haiti and try to make a difference are the same people working with drug abuse, HIV, AIDS, and so forth at home. It isn't different people.
Dr. Perry, would you like to add anything to what Dr. Taylor said?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that question many times, of course, over the years as well. And, you know, my response is that the needs are an order of magnitude different. of course, we have needs at home. We have needs in Portland. They're underserved people. But in a place like Haiti, so many people are dying every day from conditions they shouldn't be dying from. They would never die in the United States from these kinds of things. And so, you know, there's a great need there, and a lot of people think, well, it's just such a big need that what we can do is so pitiful compared to the need. What's the value of that? But you know, just being in partnership with people who are living in these situations, trying to make them better, work with programs, even if the success of the actual program isn't what we would like for it to be, just providing support and encouragement to these people who are facing such challenges, to me, has value in and of its own. And, you know, we need to be more connected with people around the world and their needs. And this relationship between Portland and Cape Haitian is such a great example of what we need much more of throughout the world. And so I really applaud the idea behind this. Of course, there are going to be naysayers out there. I've spent my life dealing with lots of them, but it's the people who get out and do something that we have to admire. And just let me say before the time runs out, because I wanted to get this in, I want to make sure that I express how much I admire Nate Nickerson. I've worked with a lot of people over my entire career in global health, and Nate is right up there at the top in terms of commitment, capacity to work in a partnership kind of a way in developing trusting relationships and inspire other people, not just the people in Portland, but the people in Cape Haitian too. And I have tremendous respect for him and his leadership and his commitment and what he's done over this time.
Great. Right, we're nearing the end of our webinar, so I'm going to open it up to the Q&A and go through some of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A section. One question is, what is your feeling now when you see how the Justinian Hospital has improved compared to the early days, 2001, 2002? Nate, would you like to handle that one?
Yeah, I think there are palpable improvement. It's slow. The Justinian, as for most people on the call will know, is the large public hospital in the north. It's a 300-bed hospital. I'm interested when people come and haven't been there in a long time. I think that for those of us that are there, have been there consistently, the improvement is slow, so it's hard to see sometimes. But when you take the longer view, I think it's dramatically different. I think for me, it's really exciting to see, for instance, mortality rates going down with the babies that are born there, and we track those kind of things, or improved outcomes for women, or improved, that supplies are available when needed, and those kind of things. So I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of what happens for patients. It's slow, it's incremental. Sometimes it feels harder than it needs to be, but it's going in the right direction, I think.
Thank you, Nate. Next question. You probably would be best person to answer this. How has the pandemic affected the work that Konbit Sante does in Haiti?
Thank you, Rod. I think the pandemic has made us realize that our work in Haiti must continue. One of the things that we've learned is during times of crisis, it's very important that we have maintained and grown relationships. So everyone here who has been instrumental in working in Cape Haitian Haiti, they've been here through the earthquake, they've seen the cholera epidemics, and been with the organizations that we partner with during those times. And I think it's been tremendously important that we stand by our partners even during this pandemic. So actually, I would say that our work has probably increased, if not decreased, and we've been standing alongside all 4 partners to see how the pandemic was realized here and how we can continue to support them.
Thank you. All right, one final question. This question is, what do you feel are the greatest accomplishments of Konbit Sante over the past 20 years? Dr. Taylor and Wendy, we'll start with you.
Oh, the greatest accomplishment?
Yes.
Nate Nickerson. Getting Nate on board. That was the greatest. The other accomplishment's a little bit more difficult for people who haven't been there, but it was creating the mission statement. It took us 7 months to figure out what it is that we really wanted to do, how we wanted to do it, so that it met our aspirations. So that was an important thing. Wendy?
Great. All right, Eva?
Yeah, I was, you know, there are so many things, Rod, that I think that we could talk about. I'm going to talk about a conversation we had today with Dr. St. Fleur, who is a pediatrician who works as part of Konbit Sante staff in Haiti. And we were talking about this question in the name of strategic planning for this year. And he was talking about how wonderful it is for him when he works with a group of residents and mentors them and helps them realize how to identify problems, how to start using data to solve problems, how to put together a research study that can help answer those questions and solve those problems. It sounds small, but that's a huge culture shift. And I think and some of the credit for that shift and how problems are identified and solved with data goes to the organization and to Nate for sure.
Henry?
Yeah, I'm remembering the truly incredible work that went on at the time of the earthquake and the cholera epidemics that ravished Haiti. And of course, the earthquake was in Port-au-Prince, but there was a massive influx of people into Cape Haitian, as well as through other parts of the country as people were leaving Port-au-Prince, and the enormous response that Konbit Sante was able to make in responding in partnership to the great needs that surfaced very quickly, I think is really symbolic of the broader relationship, but it was unexpected, but Konbit Sante rose to the occasion as something to be very proud of.
Great. And Nate, would you like to answer the same question?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the nature of the relationship, I think, is sort of the foundation of whatever's been good, whether it's the work that Dr. St. Fleur has done to reduce pediatric mortality, you know, expanding healthcare into some areas of Cape Haitian where it wasn't there before with this group ULS, you know, with whether it's with you know, working with the Baptist Hospital to introduce the first spinal cord treatment center in northern Haiti, the only one in northern Haiti. So it's the chief one. I mean, there's a lot of things that together, and following the vision of some local people, have made a big difference. And they endure, and they're part of the system now, and they're fragile. They don't. I mean, I think talk about the health center ULS. It's fragile, but it's there. It's in an area of where there wasn't any primary health care for people before. So I think they're there, and it's built up over time. But the relationship, I think, is the bottom line thing. That if we can have the kind of relationship that's felt to be mutually beneficial like that, I think that's our biggest accomplishment. So.
Great. Thank you. All right, we have reached the end of our webinar. I would like to thank all of the panelists and everyone in the audience for participating. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be reposted online at a later date. You can learn more about Konbit Sante and the work it does at konbitsante.org and donate online at konbitsante.org/donate. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope you have a good evening and take care of yourselves.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Terrific job, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.